As any kind of coach or player, one thing to remember is that the quality of our results is based on the quality of our questions. Why? Because questions determine focus. And in life, we don't get what we deserve. We get what we focus on. So here's one of the most powerful, liberating, and responsible questions we can ever ask ourselves. The question is, what is my context? In this video, we'll examine how our default game or context is often showing up to protect us, but every single day also limits what is possible for us to think, feel, experience, and achieve. So let's start with another question. If somebody throws a feather at you, how does it occur? Odd? Silly? Harmless? How about if somebody throws a kiss at you? How does that occur? Sweet? Flattering? Inappropriate? Or how about if they throw a knife at you? How might that occur? Scary? Threatening? Dangerous? In either case, the way the thing occurs to you will inform how you respond. You might smile, you might laugh, you might run. It all depends on your context at the time. For example, if you don't know the person throwing you a kiss, you might call it inappropriate. But if you love them, you might think it's sweet. Or if somebody throws a knife at you, that may trigger a fight or flight response. But if you're part of a juggling act in the circus, well then your context is different. Then it could be totally routine and nothing at all to fear. Another example is if you lose something. You lose health, wealth, a love, an opportunity, a possession, your car keys. The way the loss occurs to you will inform and limit your capacity to respond. The possible human defines context as the parameters that constrain meaning. On the job, we define working context as the parameters that constantly define meaningful action and achievement. Now here's why that's important. If the way that we respond depends on our context or the way that things occur to us, and if our context constrains or sets the limits on what a thing can mean, then in our own personal version of reality, nothing can exist for us. No ideas, thoughts, feelings, actions, no experiences, no possibilities are available to us outside of whatever we tell ourselves or convince ourselves is true. Now pay very close attention to this because here's where it gets both powerful and scary. What happens when we use the word context and identity interchangeably? Well, now my identity becomes the subconscious filter that sets the parameters that constrain what things can mean to me. Ultimately, it both limits and informs the thoughts and feelings I will have, the actions I will take, the results I will produce, and the quality of experiences I will have. Now where that becomes really frightening, not just seeing it in ourselves, but especially when seeing it in our world leaders, it's in the realization that unless we have really taken the time to look at it objectively, the biggest part of our identity, the biggest part of your identity, was forged when you were just a child. And in many cases, a very frightened child with a limited vocabulary and very little experience of how life really works and how things came to be. In order for you to survive through very scary times that didn't make any sense, you began to make things up. Because you need to understand things, to comfort yourself, to give yourself the required certainty to take any kind of action, you began to give things meaning. So when you were little, you and your new brain and you and your whole heart, you began recording, labeling, categorizing, assessing, defining, you considered, you interpreted, and you started judging everything around you. You did that in order to figure out how best to respond to whatever was happening at the time. And what that means is, with all the worldly experience of a 5 or 6-year-old child, you formed sentences that sentenced you for life. So if you've never really examined your earliest convictions about who you are, how life works, and how things came to be, therein lies your limitations. Lacking that awareness, you will continue going through life unconsciously needing and repeatedly attempting to validate and prove your own personal version of reality. Now, attempting to prove that your limited point of view is the highest or only truth, we call that playing a default game. It means in that moment you're showing up as an unconscious player whose every action is being determined by a script you wrote and authorized for yourself as a child. Your default game is a game that can't be won for 2 reasons. 1, it isn't real, and 2, you're heavily invested in having it be real. To help you understand this, let's listen in as I talk to Mark, one of my coaching clients who's graciously allowed me to share his own newfound awareness of this very powerful distinction. So just so we kind of bring folks up to speed, you are actually going into the section, and we started talking about it last week, about this whole thing called default game. Do you remember me mentioning that?
Yes, default games, very much so.
Yeah, okay, so what have you remembered, or what do you know about default games so far?
What I remember about default games is I had begun when we chatted about that, saying that I really seem to have 2 poles that were pretty close to fantasy and suffering. And my fantasy pole is basically about avoidance. And so my default game is not simply the avoidance of pain, but the avoidance of engagement, of anything that might make me appear not good enough or not able to not able to get the attention that I think I deserve, or to be liked by others. The other one, so that would be one side of the fantasy, is the fantasy of avoiding pain and being successful in avoiding pain. The other one is suffering, and so the suffering side for me, if I'm not avoiding pain, I will go deep into a very guilt and shame, and guilt and shame about things that really I shouldn't be guilty and shameful about. It's more like the shame of being myself. So my deep, to summarize it as best I can, is avoidance and shame, and then another thing occurs to me from my notes, that I'll attempt to charm people, and so the charm is basically kind of a form of manipulation, a way of saying, I don't want to find out if I don't want you to find out that I'm not really any good, but I'll at least fool you long enough to get what I want from you. So that's a little longer than I expected, but in terms of the default game.
Mark, that's perfect. What happened last week on the call?
Last week, through a couple of coaching questions, I became aware that the game that I have been playing for all of my life, sort of a desperate game that I could never win. And in realizing that I could never win that game of being good enough, I had a moment where I realized I had been wasting my time doing something that was impossible. Had given my time and my effort into doing something that was impossible, and then the rest of my time trying to avoid the pain of knowing I was in an impossible game. I couldn't win.
Yeah. And then I believe we started to look at, I don't recall for sure, but I believe we started to look at why you can't allow yourself to win. Do you remember that question?
Yeah, the question, the reason why I can't allow myself to admit that I can't win the game is I really would have a hard time knowing who I was apart from this impossible game. That the impossible game is somehow sort of infinity, that whatever narrow context this was, I couldn't imagine not being in the game.
Right, in that game, yeah. 40, 50 years, that's the guy you've been. So to set something up where you weren't that guy, well, who would you be then? Think of a time where you actually sabotaged your own success so you could continue playing your bullshit game.
Well, every yeah.